welcome everybody to this discussion today at Upstream, where our topic is Secure by Design, Proactively Engineering Software Supply Chain Security at the Largest Organizations. My name is Donald Fischer. I'm co-founder and CEO at Tidelift, and I'm excited to be moderating the panel today. A lot of the conversation in this area has been driven by emerging and sometimes still coalescing new government policies and regulations relating to software supply chain security, including in the US, in the EU, and other jurisdictions around the world. And I'm really excited today to have two leading voices joining us for a conversation about this subject matter area, share some perspectives on how some of the largest organizations in the world are contending with this shifting landscape. So first of all, I want to introduce Vijoy Pandey. So Vijoy is Senior Vice President, Emerging Technologies and Incubation, or ET&I at Cisco. ET&I is chartered to create and drive the next businesses for Cisco in an agile, ambitious, and entrepreneurial manner. And in this role, Vijoy runs product software development, research, and product-led growth teams at Cisco. And next, I want to introduce Veronica Daigle, who is Executive Director, Legislative Affairs at Boeing. In this role, she covers the government and regulations and legislation related to cybersecurity and software. So thank you so much both for joining us today. We're excited to talk about this challenging but important set of topics.
Pleasure to be here, Donald.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
Well, great. So maybe, Veronica, I was thinking maybe we could open up by asking you to share a little bit of your perspective, given that you've been the lead for cybersecurity policy in Boeing's legislative affairs for a couple of years now. Before we get into like the specifics of the nuts and bolts of the recent cybersecurity practices that apply to open source software, I thought maybe you could share a little bit of a broader perspective in terms of what's happening in Congress overall right now at the moment that we're recording this this panel. We're just getting through a bunch of debt ceiling things, and there's different legislation pending. So can you give us some situational awareness broadly to get started?
Yeah, no, absolutely, and I think you hit the nail on the head, right? The topic that's been most on people's mind these days has been the debt ceiling negotiations. And for those who don't track this every day, that would be the congressional limit on the amount that the Treasury can borrow to make payments on the U.S. debt. So there's been a lot of discussion, a lot of negotiation, but I would say that it appears that we're nearing the end of the road there. The House passed what's called the Fiscal Responsibility Act of 2023. On Wednesday, so I think when this is showing, that will have been a week ago, and the Senate passed the bill last night. So that sends it to the president's desk ahead of the deadline, or the default deadline, which would have been Monday, June 5th. So that's, now that we're there, I think there'll be some movement on some other major pieces of legislation that are important, I think, for this community. And one that I would flag in particular is the National Defense Authorization Act. And that is a major piece of legislation. It incorporates a wide range of national security issues and often can become a vehicle for other policy interests, just because it's a must-pass piece of legislation. And you can usually depend on it to be passed every year. So the congressional committees that oversee this particular piece of legislation, I think we can expect that they'll be looking at this over the next few weeks, and we'll probably have markup, which is the time when they review and make changes to it, probably about the third week in June. So there's been a little bit of delay because of all the debt ceiling negotiations, but that's something that we'll definitely be keeping an eye on, and I'm sure folks that are listening in will as well. The only other thing I might flag that I think might be of particular interest to this group is there's been a lot of interest in AI, artificial intelligence and machine learning. And there's been a lot of activity, I would say, especially over the last couple of months. So in about the April timeframe, Senator Schumer announced an effort to draft what's probably going to be like a framework for a new regulatory regime. And so that's definitely something to keep an eye on. I think there'll be a lot of movement on that. And as it matures, probably some outreach to industry as well. And there have been a number of hearings as well that are notable. The one that I would flag in particular was in May with the Senate Judiciary Subcommittee that held a hearing on oversight of AI, and it included the CEO for OpenAI, and had a lot of interesting discussions. And in particular, if folks have a chance to look at the hearing or even download some of the testimony, the OpenAI CEO had expressed support for regulations that would incentivize AI safety. So just taken together, I think we're seeing that there's some movement towards some kind of regulations. So definitely something to keep an eye on there. And I would think that the open source community is going to be really critical, I think, to the development of all of these types of conversations. And lastly, I would just say that's the legislative side. On the executive branch side, a lot of movement there too as well. The White House released a blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights. There's also an AI risk management framework. And recently, just within the last couple of weeks, the White House's Office of Science and Technology issued an RFI to get feedback to inform a national AI strategy. So this is something that the White House is developing. And I would just flag that because I think public comments are going to be due by about the beginning of July 7th. And I think they're looking, I think, for strong feedback. So it's something for the community to be engaged on as well.
Super helpful to get an update from right in the thick of it on the state of all that. It seems to be following a similar course and a lot of the similar steps to the conversation we've been having around cybersecurity and software supply chain security for the last couple of years, right? These new emerging discussions around AI. So I wonder if you could share a couple of the highlights, and especially from Boeing's perspective, how Boeing is sort of understanding, responding, reacting to some of the shifting landscape around regulations and legislation related to cybersecurity and specifically software supply chain security over the last couple of years.
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and it's an important one because cybersecurity and especially the topic for today, software supply chain security, is a significant cross-cutting issue, and it involves government, industry, and it's constantly evolving. So from the threats to the regulatory and risk landscape, and to the best practices that are going to be needed. I think we say this a lot is that supply chain security, cybersecurity, this is a team effort, and government, at both the federal, state, local level, it just plays such a crucial role, and we're just really happy and see it as very important when they support and collaborate with the private sector. So I think for Boeing, we seek those opportunities, and we're excited when we have those opportunities. So a couple of things I would just flag. There's CISA's Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative, an example of great just public-private partnerships, and also the Information and Sharing and Analysis Centers, the ISACs. There's a number of them across different sectors. So if companies have an opportunity to engage with those, it's just a great opportunity to share information and to get information about the regulatory landscape and things that are under consideration. But I would say just to flag a couple of things that have happened over the last couple of years. And Donald, I think and Vijoy, I'm sure you've seen it. There's been a lot that has happened, right? It's been a very, very busy environment for regulation and for legislation, and just great opportunities for collaboration. But I think when I first started, the Cyberspace Solarium Commission was just about to release its report, and there has just been a lot of great initiatives that have come out of that. They had 80 recommendations, I think, out of their report, and if I have it right, I think about 80 of those have been implemented or are on the process of being implemented. And a couple of big ones, is the issuance of an updated national cyber strategy, which we just saw come out earlier this year, and creating a Senate-confirmed national cyber director, which has also been just a great opportunity to coordinate activities among the federal government. So even though the Solarium Commission sunset in December of 2021, their work is continuing. They have the CSC 2.0, and so I think that's a great forum to keep an eye on. So a couple other quick ones that I would just hit on. is the cybersecurity executive order came out in May of 2021. And this was largely a response to cyber incidents like SolarWinds and Colonial Pipeline, and really looking for a way to improve the nation's cybersecurity. There are 8 sections in it, but I think the one that is probably the most meaningful for this community might be the enhancing software supply chain. So that's section 4. And it's really worth taking a look at if folks haven't, because there's a lot of important directives in there that we are seeing are slowly playing out right now. For example, NTIA released a report on minimum elements for software bill of materials, which is being referenced in a lot of follow-on guidance. NIST has released, secure software development framework, software supply chain security guidance, which is also critical. And of course, end of last year, OMB released a memo on enhancing the security of the supply chain, software supply chain, which we are seeing movement on this year. And so those are all directly related to what was in the EO. And then just a few months ago, the White House released its National Cyber Strategy, which is just an ambitious document and outlining some strategic objectives to better secure the cyberspace. But importantly, it recognizes the need for robust collaboration between the public and private sector. So I think there's a lot of important things in there as well. One of the pillars is about shaping the market to drive security and resilience. And that in particular, I think for software vendors is one to look at, because as an example, one objective would be to shift the liability for insecure software products to vendors that fail to take reasonable precautions. So, we'll see how this develops over time. But there are, sections within there that are really trying to get after those kinds of principles. And lastly, I would just say over on the legislative side, there's been some movement. There's a lot of interest over there on software bill of materials. There were a couple of provisions last year. Didn't make it into the final NDAA, but I don't think that's because of a lack of interest. I think it was, and this is, my perspective, but I think it might have been a recognition that the executive branch is really doing a lot in this space right now. And so maybe wanting to see, Congress wanting to see, well, how is that going to mature? But definitely something to keep an eye on. And for the open source software community, there was a bill that was released just a couple of months ago called the Securing Open Source Software Act of 2023. And so that has a lot of really interesting directives in it. One of them lays out a one-year timeline for CISA to provide a framework for assessing the risk of open source software components. And as a follow-on, to then assess the open source software components that are used directly or indirectly by federal agencies. So that's something to keep an eye on. It was introduced, so it's still kind of working its way through, but definitely something for the community to keep an eye on. And I would just say, if I had a quick takeaway, just on all the activity that's been happening, I think it's great for this community to get engaged. I think government is looking for engagement. There's just so many opportunities to collaborate, and I think whether it's through requests for comment, RFIs, proposed legislation. I think using these public-private collaborations and associations to stay on top of that is just key. But I think it's important to have that constant communication, especially between these different communities.
Yeah, it's been one of the things that's been really great to see from sort of the private sector industry perspective is that independent open source maintainers are being taken into account in these conversations in a way that I never really noticed before. I was surprised and delighted when the National Cybersecurity Strategy was briefed in the White House press briefing room, and senior administration official raised the specific role of independent open source maintainers, and pointed out that they should not individually bear responsibility for cybersecurity vulnerabilities in their open source projects, but that somebody has to, sort of a vendor or assembler there. So it's nice to see that there's a sophistication and there's communication happening there, and a message is being received and conveyed usefully. So I'd love to bring Vijoy into the conversation. Of course, Cisco is, among its many worldwide customers are national governments, and there's a lot of attention to the regulatory environment there. So I'd love to, maybe start off by asking you, what role do you see and what role do you think government should be playing in this conversation around cybersecurity broadly and specifically securing open source software supply chains? And maybe along with that, what role do you see for private industry to be part of this conversation, as Veronica suggests?
Yeah, I think so. Thank you, Veronica, for that very enlightening summary of what's been going on. There's a lot happening, as you pointed out, and I think we've been trying to catch up and keep up to pace with our counterparts in government affairs as well at Cisco, because this is so front and center for everything that we do. And I think I would say regulations sound heavy and they sound as if they are slowing down innovation. So I think of it more like, yes, we are talking about safety and we're talking about the fact that we're doing things responsibly, right? And we're talking about security. And I also feel that it's a miss by the private industry, it's a miss by the community that we didn't solve the purpose or the problem, and we had to wait for regulations to happen. So I feel that it's a big miss on our part, and it shouldn't even have come to this. I mean, I think that's the way I think about it. But also, I think in terms of governments putting these things down, absolutely, because otherwise you're on a course that takes you in a bad direction. Number two, I would also think of it as government should not just be thinking about regulations, but like Veronica, you were pointing out, like the National Cyber Strategy document that came out. I mean, we should be government should be pushing boundaries when it comes to technology as well. So it's not just regulations around safety and security, but pushing the boundary when it comes to technology, which brings me to the belief that I have that eventually I feel, as a technologist, I feel technology is there to solve all of technology's problems. So yes, we can put regulations in place, yes, we can put strategies in place and frameworks in place, but in the end, we need tech to solve tech problems. And that's where I think the private industry comes in. That's where I think there is a wake-up call for the open source community as well. And there's a lot happening. As you know, we are also part of the OpenSSF Foundation, and there's a lot happening in the open source community. The security scorecards piece that you're familiar with, Donald, as well. And also, software vendors are waking up and figuring out that they need to fix this if they have to sell it into Fed accounts. But also, other enterprises are waking up and figuring out, hey, if the Feds are worried about this, we need to be worried about this. And so, I can tell you, Cisco as an internal organization, our CISO is like, what are we doing about this? And can we ensure that we have our software bill of materials figured out, and are we up and current around all of the security practices? So this is a wake up call for the entire industry. But in the end, I think tech needs to solve for this. And I would say companies like Tidelift, Donald, are there to help make that happen. So it's pretty encouraging to see a little bit of a spark being lit behind everybody here, and we're all run towards fixing something that is pretty important. And I just want to touch upon the other thing that Veronica brought up. There are big parallels between safety and security in the software space and the work that's happening in AI. And yes, there are differences, but there are like big parallels there as well. So all of this work and the sophistication, to your point, Donald, that government agencies and individuals are actually required to have this conversation is actually a good thing, because it will drive the industry forward as a whole.
I agree. And one of the things that I appreciate about Cisco's role in this conversation is, in addition to contending with these, new requirements and new environment, Cisco is also investing in helping other organizations tackle these challenges, right? And so, specifically, I know you've been your team at Cisco in the Emerging Technologies and Incubation Group has been working on new products, new technology capabilities to help developers and operators tackle some of these secure development challenges. So I wonder if you want to could share a little bit about some of the work that you're doing over there, some of the product direction, some of the technology and actually open source projects that you've been you've been advancing within those teams at Cisco.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I think again, it goes back to the belief that, and I know you are on the same page here, Donald, but is the belief that tech needs to solve for tech problems. And so, if there are open source security problems that we need to pay attention to, then can we either contribute to or even launch some open source projects that help fill these gaps that exist in the community out there? And there's a whole slew of really awesome projects out there that we participate in. Like, I mean, OpenSSF is across a bunch of these things as well. But also as part of, I mean, we are big in open source. I mean, we are part of the Open Source Security Foundation. We are part of CNCF, the Apache Foundation, a whole bunch of projects there. And we feel that there is a big gap when it comes to software bill of materials and how we bring transparency there. There's a big gap around, again, scanning code and systems and figuring out what gaps exist. I mean, there's this whole industry push behind securing modern applications, because what's happening out there is increasingly the software assets that are being used to build any modern application are coming from all sorts of places. They're coming from public cloud providers, they're coming from SaaS providers, where you're just poking APIs, public APIs, and using them in your application, from mobile APIs on a phone to 70% or more of any software packaged or SaaS is actually open source. And so, in this kind of a very distributed environment, how do you guarantee security? And yes, it's great that we have all of these regulations and we need to comply to them, but how do you comply to them? And so we are looking at that problem statement end to end, from how you build your applications to securing what's been built to securing where it runs, because that's the entire life cycle. So how, what, where. And I think we are looking at all the gaps that exist and coming out with open source tooling that either fills those gaps or helps bring these tools together, because that's the other challenge. Because in open source, if there's a problem, you throw a tool and then suddenly you have, especially in security, like there are hundreds and hundreds of tools. So is there something that can bring all of these things together, make sense of it, provide context and prioritize it? I mean, we need tools like that. So we've been releasing a whole slew of tools around, we're calling that the Open Clarity suite. And clarity is, as you can imagine, it's clarity around open source projects and security around that. So we've released API clarity, we've released Kube clarity, and we've just released VM clarity. And these look at security in the API space, in the Kubernetes and container space, and in the VM and the virtual machine space as well. So, and you know that, Donald, you and I are working pretty closely as well to figure out how we can tie these things together into a holistic viewpoint that any organization can get.
Absolutely. And for sure, the role of the actual creators and maintainers of that software, the open source, independently managed, maintained open source software, is so central to that conversation. So, we're excited to figure out how we can work with, align the independent maintainers that Tidelift works with organizations like Cisco and Boeing to go tackle this area. I do want to pick up on the that word clarity that is being used in to frame the conversation for a number of Cisco's projects in this space. And maybe, Veronica, to come back to you, one of the things that I think has been clarifying or providing additional clarity in terms of the government's policy position here is trying to up-level the conversation from all of these individual protocols and standards and detailed specifications, et cetera, to the bigger picture messaging. And a couple of the phrases that I hear consistently now repeated are secure by design, secure by default. Right? These are sort of seem to be the messaging elements that help simplify and clarify the communication here. So I'm curious if you can lend any perspective on how the government's thinking about what does that mean, secure by design, secure by default? How is that going to get reflected in the legislation or the policies that get implemented, and again specifically with this to inform what those independent open source maintainers need to be thinking about as what's their role in achieving security by design and security by default.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. These have become just ubiquitous terms, right? That we are hearing, especially, and they are gaining momentum. And I just want to just really quickly just stop on what Vijoy just was talking about, and the importance of the community being involved. I think there is just so much that policymakers can learn from the experts, from the developers and the maintainers, those who are working this every day. And I think that is just so crucial that those connections are made, because you want to make sure that whatever policy or regulations come out are going to be implementable, executable, that they make sense to those who are actually, working these issues every day. So just wanted to say, it's great that tech is working this, and I think it's just so important that tech is getting the message out to policymakers. So just applaud everything that you're doing there. In terms of secure by design and secure by default, I think first, let me just give a quick background. If folks aren't, and I'm sure everybody is familiar with them at this point, but the way I think about it, right, secure by design, it's kind of self-explanatory, right? It's an approach where you are incorporating security at every stage of the software development cycle, from the design, building, testing, and deployment. So it's really that idea of thinking about how are we going to ensure that there is security just built into this and it's embedded. So it's not only the actions, but it's also the philosophy. And then secure by default, that's where you're actually establishing those configurations and settings and incorporating them into your software. So I've heard, the great, example, if you're in your everyday life would be like airbags, right? Or seatbelts that are in your car. So the idea is that you just have these default safety features that are already there, so that you're taking some of the responsibility off of the end user, and you're building in these protections, as you're developing the software. And hopefully together, these principles, when they're applied to things like open source software, it's going to give you the strong foundation and the roots that are going to be needed for software development, and hopefully reduce some of the vulnerabilities that there might be. So that's just big picture. That's what I think we're talking about, and the government, I believe, is to your question, Donald. I think the government is very interested in this. We've heard it notably. Earlier this year, CISA's Jen Easterly and Eric Goldstein wrote an article in Foreign Affairs where they spoke about this very eloquently, about a lot of other things. But I think that's a good starting point if you're trying to get an idea of where some of the government agencies may be thinking, and how they're thinking about this in terms of software. And Director Easterly then spoke about it again at a Carnegie Mellon event, where she really kind of foot stomped some of those issues. But this concept, of secure by design and secure by default, and the idea of shifting that liability for insecure software products, away from the end user, where you're having to do multiple patches, and it's what did the user do, and you're moving it, more towards the development side. That's a major component of the national cyber strategy as well. So when we talk about the government, where the government's going, I think looking there is also there's a lot of insight to be drawn about what we might see. So, and Donald, I know Tidelift has a number of initiatives to help these communities. So just I think as we work together, these are going to be really important, because I do think the government is interested in this.
Yeah, I mean, the overall theme for Upstream this year is the accidental supply chain. Sort of observing the fact that we have all become individually, and our organizations have collectively become dependent on these open source projects that are created by folks, usually not with the intent of becoming part of Boeing or Cisco or the US government or somebody's commercial supply chain. But we have to contend with that reality that they actually are, right? These open source projects are integral, and we need to find a way to not just, I think, make demands upon those, but also design useful incentive mechanisms that can align the interests of regulators with the organizations, large organizations that are being regulated, with those individual humans with lives and interests that we need to figure out how to work with. So that's where a lot of our energy is at Tidelift, and of course in our collaborations with both of your organizations as well as with the open source community. So maybe I'd love to turn it back to Vijoy and ask a little bit about how y'all view the your game plan for engaging with open source communities, especially with these not traditionally corporate backed projects. I mean, Cisco has this incredible legacy in open source communities, but I know also there are new and ongoing initiatives. There's the open source program office effort, et cetera. So would love to understand a little bit of perspective from you about how do you see the Cisco's opportunity to engage with those independent creator communities behind this accidental supply chain?
Yeah, that's actually a pretty awesome theme there, Donald. It is we are all entering that accidentally, so to speak, which is not a great look for us. I mean, again, like I pointed out, as a community, as an industry. Uh, so we just established or re-established our open source program office. I think 3 years ago, we were a little bit scattershot when it came to pushing open source contributions and projects, and I think we've just brought it all together across the company in the OSPO space through the OSPO a couple of years ago. And yes, there is a big push from Cisco in making sure that we are pushing the right open source to solve security problems in the application space, in the infrastructure space, and so on. But I'm not saying this just because I'm in a Tidelift event call here, Donald, but also this is the reason why we invested in Tidelift is because it's a big gap. The problem that you are trying to solve is actually a big gap. Because if you think about open source ecosystems, yes, there is openness and then the fact that people are trying to solve the right problem, but it also brings in the notion of it's a community and you want to grow the community. And why do you want to grow the community? Because people gravitate towards a problem statement because it's at the right priority for everybody. So there is this natural selection of the right priority of problems. And there is a scaling factor because then more people come in and gravitate towards that. And suddenly you have the scale, which is pretty organic. So that's the reason why open source communities exist. And to solve problems, security problems, let's say, that occur in those communities, you have to leverage the strength of that fundamental attribute. So you cannot go in and say every private organization go and solve security problems 10 times over. It doesn't make hundreds and millions of times over. In fact, you would want to leverage the same community for those very reasons of prioritization and scaling and openness and all of those aspects and leverage that community to solve those problems. So, which is where I think the work that you're doing and Tidelift is doing is actually so crucial because you need to reach out to those developers and those maintainers and enable them to fix the security problems, to fix the safety problems that exist in those projects. And Cisco is a big believer in that, and I'm sure Boeing is as well. And that's why we are here. There's no other way of solving this.
Yeah, and Veronica, I know that Boeing also has an active and increasingly active, I think, open source program office effort as well. I wonder if you have any commentary to share on that and the motivations for that. I assume they're similarly aligned to some of what Vijoy is describing at Cisco.
Yeah, no, I can't say enough about our open source program office. I just, from my position, they're just an invaluable office to have within Boeing. And we actually launched our OSPO, gosh, I guess it's going on 2 years now. and it's just an amazing team. They've made a real change, I think. But fundamentally, the reason we created it was we wanted to make it easier for our developers to consume and better manage, open source software. But that's internally. But then externally, we wanted to contribute even more to the open source communities. And I think having the OSPO has just been a great way to do that. And I would hope that in so doing, that we're, you know, just an example, I guess, or just helping within our own sector to to encourage that and to encourage others to create an open source program office. I'm not sure if this is how much this happens in others, but I've heard that some companies will have their open source program offices in the legal office, but we've actually chosen to place ours within the software organization, just because we like having that community and having that directness and truly leaning into the to the developers and those who do all the work in that field. So it's been just really terrific, Donald, and I think we're using it to support the efforts of external open source software communities like the Linux Foundation and Cloud Native Computing Foundation. Just being very active there, and then also supporting our internal developers. Just helping them to more easily create and contribute to the projects that they're doing. And I can just say the number of open source projects at Boeing has just been rapidly increasing. So it's we expect it to continue to grow. But if I can say, selfishly, as from within legislative affairs, I think we've just talked about all of the interest among government policymakers in how do we ensure more secure software development, and really just open source software is just such a unique area here. And so I think there are often questions about, okay, well, are the same principles going to apply? And how do we address open source software, and how should the regulations be crafted? How does it get incorporated? So having the OSPO and having this team that I can turn to for just their insights and their expertise has just been just been invaluable, and it also enables me to share information about what's happening out there in the regulatory and legislative landscape with them, and then they can disseminate that, not only internally but to their colleagues. So anyway, so if I'm too effusive, let me know. But I just think it's just been great for us, and I just appreciate everything that they've been doing.
I mean, we've had the opportunity to collaborate with some of the folks on the Boeing open source program office team, and it's a very good bunch. And I take your point around, not getting trapped in a defensive or kind of scarcity mindset discussion around this. I mean, so many of the regulations, the regulatory conversations, the policy conversations have been driven by, security, preventing attacks, and so on. But we also have to kind of maintain that optimistic view of like, it's amazing that this happens, that there's this emergent phenomenon when you get a bunch of creative humans together, interconnected with the internet and with these, tools and capabilities. They come together to jointly create this amazing abundance of open source software. So I wonder if maybe as a parting note, Vijoy, I'd love to hear your perspective on, what's the optimistic view here that's not, purely defensive, prevent vulnerabilities, but what more value can we unlock together by enabling this creative spirit responsibly, safely, but without, impeding it? How can we accelerate the, value creation around open source software?
Yeah, I think it's amazing you use the word impeding it, because I think no developer wakes up and says, let me write insecure code. I mean, that doesn't happen, right? No developer will wake up and say, you know what, I'm going to fix a security bug that has been fixed 10 times over by other people, and let me just go ahead and do that today in my day job. It doesn't happen. So the mundane, the insecure in the insecure software practices, I mean, that's not something that developers would want to do. But it's we have not pushed the bar far enough. So in a way that these things go away. So I think the way I look at this is, as an industry, as a community, we are here finally pushing the bar to the point where you hear this term DevSecOps. To me, it's not a team, it's a paradigm. It's just a state of thinking, which says security is a first class citizen and development is not, developers and SecOps and SREs are not enemies of each other, right? They just need to work together to solve a problem, which is build awesome applications that solve business problems. And so the more that we can do as either private companies or as open source communities to help remove that friction so that it just becomes part of the software development lifecycle. You don't think about it, and all the regulations that are there in place or all the frameworks that are out there become part of that framework and just happen automatically. That's the world that we need to be at. And so to me, it's a velocity statement that we're making. To me, we're saying we're going to do velocity with safety and responsible frameworks in place. And that's the world that we're moving towards. There's nothing, I mean, that's is only positives that we can think about. It's not, there's a little bit of a hiccup while we get there, but we need to get there.
I love it. Thank you for ending us on a positive note. And on another positive note, I super appreciate both of you individually joining the conversation today. And we appreciate the role of your respective organizations and the partnership that you're demonstrating day in and day out with the open source community. We think it's really essential for independent open source creators to understand these perspectives of large organizations like Boeing and Cisco and the U.S. government, indeed, and the kind of regimen that they're living in and thinking in when they're using open source projects. And it's also important for your organizations to understand the perspective of those independent creators. So that's what Upstream is about. We're trying to facilitate that conversation. And I super appreciate you're all joining us to contribute today. Thanks for joining us here at Upstream today, Vijoy and Veronica.
It was a great discussion. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much for the opportunity. Great to see you.